Dear audience, you might have noticed whenever labor organizations and employees act in concert, they create an incredible impact, and our next panel gives proof of this. The Labour Ministry and the Policy Lab Digital Work and Society are our hosts, as you know, and they proudly introduce a research project about AI experiments in a business environment. That's an international cooperation of IBM, the German labor organization Verdi, and the University of Maastricht. Mats, I'm pretty sure that will be a tasty cherry on the top.
Cherry on top. Well, that's quite a benchmark for today's final session of this conference. We'll do our very best to keep up with it, of course, with your high expectations. And that actually brings me to the point. Expectations were quite high as well as a study a few years ago by two Oxford fellows with the name Benedict Frey and Michael Osborne circulated in the public media. You might have heard about it. Its title was The Future of Employment, not unemployment. It was actually about unemployment, but it was the future of employment in the title. Frey and Osborne published a list of 702 jobs, and for each and single one of them, they proposed an exact percentile rank for the probability of its automation within the upcoming AI technologies. I remember a popular German weekly newspaper actually even putting a form on their website where you could type in your job title and it would tell you, based on this study, the probability of you being automated pretty much. I was lucky I didn't know what to type in by the time, but I think many people had to find out their jobs probably wouldn't be there in the near future anymore. Well, but if you had a closer look on the design of the study, if you actually read it instead of just copying this list, which some people did, you'd find out that it was based on interviews, an evaluation of interviews with around 10 experts in the field of AI and automation. This is one way to gain knowledge, obviously, evaluating interviews, but making a percentile rank and an exact number with 2 digits after the dot for every single job in a list of 702 just from around 10 interviews, that seems kind of bold nowadays. But the situation didn't even change that much. There is a lot of opinions, there's a lot of suggestions and ideas about the impact of AI on work, on society, but there is very little actual facts or reasonable research about this, and that's what we want to discuss today. What can we actually know about the effects of AI on the workplace and on society, and how can we measure it in a robust scientific way? I'm happy to introduce my two guests for today's final session. You could say, it's just two guests. It's kind of a fireside session. We don't have a fireside here, but I think we can't light anything. First guest would be Dr. Marie-Christine Fregin. She is a research leader at Maastricht University School of Business and Economics. She has a background in sociology and political science, and in her research, she focuses on the impact of digitalization on work and the workers, and she does her study between practice and research. To her, experiments in the field, so-called randomized controlled trials, are the very solution to gain solid insight on AI. Hello, Marie-Christine. And our second guest is Dr. Mark Nitzberg. He is Executive Director of the UC Berkeley Center for Human Compatible AI. And he worked in the industry as well. He worked at Bell Laboratories, Microsoft, Amazon. One could say you've been all over the place pretty much. And so he knows what he's talking about. And he is the co-author of Solomon's Code, an examination of AI and how it reshapes values, trust and power. And Mark has an interesting position in this field on how we should deal with technology and algorithms in the future to make them actually applicable to or applicable to society. He demands trials for algorithms, just like the Federal Drug Administration does them in the US or the EMA does them in Europe. Did I get that about right, Mark?
Yes, thank you. It's great to be here.
Thank you too. So before we start into the discussion with you two, I'd like to ask Marie-Christine, could you give us a glimpse into your research, a small introduction? What do you do?
Happy to do that. And let's start with this presentation. That was the signal to the regie. I think the slides are coming up. Well, the implementation of AI on workplaces poses hard and societally very relevant problems with implications for both businesses and the people. While more and more firms make use of learning algorithms, the consequences of AI implementation are not well understood. If we want to understand better how AI will affect the future of work, then the main challenge that we need to tackle is to understand really in detail how AI will transform occupation, work environments, and how this affects employees. So this is really about, if AI is implemented, what does it mean? What's happening on the ground? If we fail to unravel these underlying mechanisms, understanding how AI will shape the future of work will remain very difficult, also in the future. That being said, measuring AI consequences is also not an easy task. It requires quite sophisticated research designs, and one could consider the gold standard, so-called field experiments. These field experiments work like drug trials. They're not conducted in labs, but they're conducted in the field. In our case, we study the implementation of AI in corporate contexts. At the beginning of such an observation phase, ideally, no worker has access to the AI solution under study. During the field experiment, then in a company, a randomly selected group of workers starts working with AI assistants. This is the so-called treatment group. And for the duration of the experiment, the other workers continue working as they did before without AI assistance. That would be the control group. For such a controlled trial, the nice thing is that it enables us to evaluate the causal effects of AI on workers and jobs. Such field experiments can be used to build bridges between science and practice, and they can provide very valuable insights for companies, for example, when facing the challenge of strategic workforce planning, and also for the social partners who need to build the regulative environments for AI use. From this perspective, field experiments can complement nicely the R&D process on AI in companies with a socioeconomic dimension. Of course, if we do field experiments, our scientific ambition is to learn something new, and yes, also to run those models. But we think science is a team exercise, and we therefore want team science also to team up and to come together with the stakeholders of technological and societal change. Therefore, we engaged in this pilot project that has been mentioned already, and we conducted one first field experiment in a quite innovative setting. So this field experiment, or this entire project, has been jointly initiated by IBM and the German service sector union Vereinte Dienstleistungsgewerkschaft Verdi, and it was conducted in cooperation with the Ministry of Labor and Social Affairs. All details on this project can be found on a brochure. You see the link on the slide. But let me here just briefly outline, because we're here to talk about field experiments, what we studied. So we used the field experiment to capture the bigger picture of AI effects on workers and jobs, and we seek to combine the business case and the people case. So therefore, three main research questions. How does AI implementation affect productivity and performance of workers in different jobs? How does AI change work tasks, and how does it change skill requirements? And how does it affect working conditions and worker well-being? And for this project, it was a very engaged network of executives, of AI experts, policymakers, but also union representatives, next to the scientists, of course, that made this project fly. It's quite challenging to set something up like this, but a very interesting and also probably very good way of conducting research. And of course, this project was only the start. The Ministry of Labor and Social Affairs is currently evaluating a research proposal that we submitted, and for a project for which we want to conduct 3 more field experiments with companies from different sectors. By contrast to the pilot with IBM and Verdi, however, we now plan to combine field experiments with analyses of more general AI-related developments in the labor market. I outlined some advantages of field experiments. There's also disadvantages, and one of them is that the findings based on single firm studies are, of course, not representative for the entire working population. To overcome this, we seek to combine the strengths of experimental studies with analyses of large German register data. These data are not available to a Dutch university, of course, but they are available to the IAW, the Institut für Arbeitsmarkt und Berufsforschung in Nuremberg, who we are then planning to partner with for the future research. And also, pulling off field experiments is a very complex issue and not only challenging from an intellectual and scientific point of view. Everyone involved in such an exercise has to deal with a very high degree of uncertainty, but also with different and also potentially conflicting interests. This requires skills that we as scientists do not necessarily always have. In the new research project that we're currently planning, we are planning to partner, therefore, with Zukunft 2 GmbH, which is an innovation agency in Berlin. They can set up the co-creation process as professionally as we set up the research itself. Together, we can then provide spaces for peer learning between executive, policymakers, union representatives, and scientists, and promote the exchange that has been discussed so often during this conference also, and empowering those who really should learn together to also do that, to learn together. Before we now engage in the discussion with Mark Nitzberg, let's just wrap up with this. The kind of research that I talked about here, field experiments can provide a very strong contribution to the literature in the social science, which is a very, in this case, at a very early stage. And moreover, such research can also support proactive policy making to achieve people-centered AI. And the nice thing then is that not only the technology, but also the science, it's geared to social objectives. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Marie-Christine. So I understood what you are doing and what are the goals eventually in the process, but maybe you could elaborate a little more on the specific advantages of this kind of study design in comparison to other designs, like just making an interview with experts.
Yeah, so if you design a field experiment that's really tailor-made for data that are from within a specific setting. We call this tool that we as researchers have Insider Econometrics. It's Insider because it uses data from within a firm, and it's Econometrics because it uses econometric methods, statistical methods to analyze those data. The nice thing is, of course, that it allows us to analyze mechanisms, especially when we combine field experiments with more qualitative pre-studies, and to study outcomes on the ground, seeing what is happening on the ground within these companies. That's the advantage. The disadvantage is, of course, that it always only captures what is happening in this moment with this technology in this setting. So that's one of the disadvantages. But what makes it a gold standard, of course, is that it is a way, experimental studies are a way to get at least closer to the causal effects of AI on workers and jobs.
Thank you, Marie-Christine. I have some questions. I brought some questions for a talk tonight, but obviously the audience is very much invited to have their own, and you too as well, of course. But if you're sitting in front of your computer and you wanna ask a question, you can just follow the Slido link under the video or go directly to Slido and ask the questions. I have a small computer here on my table, so I'm gonna see. There is a question. I'm gonna spare that for later, but we're gonna have audience questions as well. Mark, you are, well, there is quite a discourse in the field of AI, the future of AI, impact on working environments, and you are one of the, well, heard voices, I'd say, in this discourse. What do you think? How does Marie-Christine's kind of research would contribute to this discourse?
Well, first of all, I would like to commend Marie-Christine for basically using the gold standard for measuring causality, right? The randomized controlled trials are definitely the gold standard, and there really are very few examples of this in measuring AI impacts at this point. So I'm very much encouraged by this project. I think the project is really just the beginning of a large and complex program, and it I think is trailblazing, because if you look at what we really need to do, we need to be measuring outcomes for harms and for benefits systematically. And we need to use what we know about experimental design. So as it is now, we are looking at a new era with incredible power in the tools and unprecedented connectivity, the potential for automating our processes in the workplace and in every part of our lives, that risk amplifying the bad with the good, and as we've seen in media with disinformation, amplifying quite effectively with consequences. But again, we're looking at this, and we're sort of making an adjustment of our hot and cold in the bathtub, and then we have to wait until the tub fills up and then check the temperature and see how we did. And it's much better to have this this well-defined experiment. But I say it's a significant undertaking. It will take a lot of time and resources, really, to set up the experiment properly and to collect the data.
And thank you, Mark. Would you say that this already meets your proposal for kind of an FDA trials for algorithms? Is this a part of it from your perspective?
Absolutely. This is. I think there was an article that came out in a law review in I believe it was 2016. Proposing an FDA for algorithms. That was several years before my article came out with Olaf and Stuart Russell, proposing the same thing, and I was unaware of it at the time. But it goes into some detail and talks about what such an FDA would do. FDA is Food and Drug Administration in the United States, but really it is a standards body as well as a regulated body, right? And there is something similar that is contemplated in the EU Commission's proposal on AI regulation. So I think what it would do is it would set standards as the Commission's proposed AI regulation does. For example, which kinds of algorithms or which kinds of application areas are high risk and which are lower risk, and that the various kinds of performance standards and standards for transparency and so forth. And then it would act as a regulator to impose regulations. And some of those regulations could turn into best practices in specific industries, and others could forbid uses in certain settings and so forth. So I think we are going to get something like an FDA for algorithms in Europe in 2-3 years, I'd like to see the United States as well, possibly following Europe.
Thanks, Mark. Marie-Christine, is that what you have in mind with your research? Is that where it's supposed to lead?
Well, what we have in mind certainly is a contribution to this, but I really don't believe that this big exercise can be done by single researchers or by single projects. And I think, well, the AI Observatory itself, that might go into this direction. Part of it is setting up research collaborations with people like us, with international research teams. I think it could contribute something, but by no means I have the idea that it could contribute everything that is needed. I think actually the such research with field experiments can complement existing research that might not be able to study mechanisms because they're out of the reach of these researchers, but it can only provide an addition, a complement probably, but certainly not all of it can be done with this.
Okay, thanks. Our audience is already very keen on hearing about results. I mean, you're in the start of your research. Can you already tell us something about what you find out in the first round, Marie-Christine?
Yes, well, you can also read all of it in this for sure, but I can also tell about it. So we conducted a mixed method study in an industry company and a first field experiment with a telecommunications provider. There we studied the implementation of a robotics tool that was not learning yet, but still a robotics tool in a call center. What you can there see is that it really changes the way people do their work. It changes how they work. And it's not self-evident that from the start it has a positive impact on productivity. Of course, data is noisy, but you do see that the positive effect that we might have expected is not necessarily there from the start. We do see effects, for example, on how work is, on the personal effort of employees. We do also see effects on the way that customers perceive the competency of employees. But yeah, quite surprising that the positive effect that we expected to find was not there right from the beginning. But of course, technology that is newly implemented first disturbs a working process. It disturbs people in their routines, and disturbance might always lead to at least not a productivity increase. It's very interesting. It would have been very interesting.
Marie-Christine, can I just intervene for a second? Do you by any chance have a headset or something? The sound is very difficult for us to understand right now.
Oh, sorry. We checked it. It was perfect.
Yes, but it can change over time. So do you have, I don't know, earplugs with microphone or something? No. Okay. So then we try. We'll focus much more on your words and try to. Can you just get a little closer to your laptop, or is that an option?
Yeah. Is that better?
I can't see you anymore, but I think I hear you better. Can you just say something? Yeah.
Is that better now?
It's a little better now. I think we can, yeah.
All right.
Hear better. Okay. So, okay, where were we? Back to the results. I didn't want to interrupt.
Back to the results, yeah. Productivity, noisy data, not necessarily a positive effect. However, and that's also one thing that the Enquete Commission in Germany recommended, is that we need to follow workers over a longer period of time, and that we can not only measure the effects over the first weeks, as we did in this first project, but that we need to come up with study designs to be able to measure effects in the longer run. And that, of course, is especially interesting and relevant when we talk about learning algorithms. So that's what we're up to doing. It requires, as Mark also already said, it requires more resources, it requires more time, also just calendar time, to follow people over time. And that, I think, is what we're up to with the next project, where we might hopefully have more time and also the possibility to conduct and observe what's happening in the field for a longer period.
Thank you very much, Mark. Is that is that what you would have expected from experimental studies like these, or would you have expected differently? Is there a different to your perspective on the development of AI in the workplace?
Well, there's been 5 solid years of hand-wringing where we talk about what might be, and then empirical observation. And so it's nice to hear some of the early results of well-defined experimental observation. I'd love to know from Marie-Christine what the timescale is for this initial study and what the timescale is for your next phase.
The timescale for the initial study, it was a pilot that at the beginning had no clearly defined time range. So we conducted the experiment over 10 consecutive weeks, which is not enough to study long-term effects. And that's one of the reasons why in this new proposal, we propose field experiments for at least 10 months, if not even longer, with all the phases included, because you first have to properly define the experiment, you have to come up with a randomization strategy together. That all takes time. But in an ideal world, we will be able to follow the employees and follow the development of productivity, follow the development of other workplace outcomes over several consecutive months. And
could you humor me and just give a couple of examples of just what specific tasks were automated and not automated in the control group? What exactly was being compared?
For example, in this first study, where that was about robotic desktop automation, what was automated is part of the process that customer service advisors did during customer calls. So while they were talking on the phone with a customer, the system, a kind of interactive assistant, popped up, took over part of the work that had to be done, and also guided the agent through this process while the customer's on the phone, whereas the control group simply worked as they did before, because the technology has been implemented in a staggered design 1 week after each other for a new group of employees. How this will look like in the new field experiments, we don't really know yet, because it's way too early in the process. But it could look somehow similar, that you implement it in different production lines, where then the employee, one important part of the employees just do what they did before without the assistant, without an assisting system, and the others kind of get AI assistance. So, for example, have an assistant, an artificially based assistant that, for example, provides potential decisions. For example, does a component have an error or does it not have an error? It provides kind of a recommendation, and the human then, of course, still has the possibility to make the decision, but with an assisted system.
I think this is a perfect example of the ideal use of an AI system. You want to have recommendations, but not hard decisions, right? And then the ultimate decision is made by the person. When I was at Amazon, one of the things that all of the executives are required to do is to work in all of the roles at the customer service center and at the sorting and what's called the fulfillment center. And so I used such a system to help me through customer service calls And I can tell you that it made it possible with very little training on my part, for me to provide better customer service than I possibly could have without that system. And so I would hope that your experimental results show some improvement in efficacy and ultimate customer satisfaction, which I guess is the purpose of such a system.
Yeah, in the first experiment it did indeed. For the next experiments, of course, we don't know. But I fully agree that it's very important to look at both. Look at what it really does to productivity. Look at probably even the returns to invest, I don't know. But also to take into account the people case, take into account what it does to the people. Because in a positive sense, also probably in a way that is kind of stressful, because it increases fears, or it just changes routines, or it takes away tasks that are relaxing because they are repetitive. Because relaxing task might also be a small pause between two more complex tasks. And I think what you just described is what we're exactly trying to do by not only looking at key performance indicators. By the way, it's also not so easy to do that because data is noisy, but also, for example, because with the implementation of AI, there might be new KPIs, new key performance indicators that are not there before the implementation of the AI. But it's also very relevant to really look at how it affects working conditions and how it affects the workers, what the skills they use, what tasks they do, and of course, what tasks they do. That is not only, I think there really the field experiments can only have a limited, can only provide limited evidence, but it can be complemented with more qualitative, at least pre-studies, to really understand what is the AI, how is the AI changing the service delivery process or the production process, how is it changing tasks to be done by humans, to then measure really the effects.
Thank you, Marie-Christine. Mark, gaining a better understanding of the impact of AI, as Marie-Christine described it, is, well, obviously a nice thing to have, so to speak. We do know more, but what do we do with the outcome of this kind of research? What would you have in mind? How can we put those ideas, those experiences, this knowledge into actually gaining traction in society, having an impact?
Well, I recently had a call from the head of ethics at Google asking for precise definitions of certain harms from AI. You know, what is privacy and what is bias and what other harms should we measure? And what she was really looking for was a precise definition and then actionable measures. And that is a very simple question to ask, but to get the answer, you need to be doing what Marie-Christine is doing, right? And so I would be keeping the measure of benefit and the measure of harm as my experimental, outcome measure. That is the y-axis, right? So we have the control group that is not using a certain kind of automation, and the experiment group that is using this kind of automation, and then measure. So, for example, how it affects the motivation and the feeling of fulfillment in the worker, and then a sense of all of the measures of well-being, I would say, right? Employee well-being, in addition to measuring the efficacy, the overall efficacy. But I think the eye is on the potential harms, and we only know of certain potential harms, and so we really just have to have an open mind and measure some broader aspects of well-being and of the social fabric in companies and more broadly. I would say that's to be determined, but that's how I would characterize it.
Yeah, and you could also add to that kind of the objective usefulness, which might be on performance, and the subjective usefulness, which is probably more, how does it change the need for recovery? How does it change technology acceptance? How does it change job satisfaction? All kind of things like this. So yeah, I think it's two different ways of looking at the same thing, but I fully agree that we should definitely take into account both.
Well, the advantage of research is obviously you have time. I don't know if you would have time if you would ask for like kind of a mandatory trial on all algorithms. You could say like harm's already done when you actually find out that it wasn't supposed to have this kind of outcome. Mark, what do you think about this argument often heard about regulating AI? We don't have the time to wait for somebody to find out there is actually no bad outcome, no unwished results.
I think this is part of the difficulty of any new technology. It seems that human beings tend to be better at creating technology and adopting it than we are at recognizing the ethical and societal implications and putting guardrails around it. I tend to towards the I'm more of a regulator than I am of the sort of free market approach. I think it's entirely appropriate for certain new technologies to be paused or put on the list if they're deemed as potentially harmful to be studied. One could bring out again, this is part of what the FDA is doing, right? A classification of those algorithms or those particular application areas where there are greater perceived risk of potential harm. But in the end, I think there will be inventions that will always make it out of the lab before we know about harms, and then we just need to be watchful, and we may need to try to put the cat back in the bag for such things. An example of that here in the United States is the face recognition system that was just put together by scraping all of the publicly available pictures of faces associated with names. And this is called Clearview, and put together by a private firm and sold to police departments. And that preceded the debate over whether it made sense to allow the police to use this. And so certain jurisdictions now in certain states, it's forbidden to use it. But it certainly came out before the ethical debate began. So I think these kinds of things will be happening and perhaps at an increasing rate.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. Having a look at our time right now, I'd like to have two final questions. Obviously, one for each one of you. Marie-Christine, you already mentioned you just started your research. There's next steps. Could you elaborate on that a little more? There's a lot more to find out. What are the next, what's the plan for your next research projects?
Well, the plan is to run 3 more field experiments with 3 different companies. And also, and I think that is very important here, to co-create those designs in order to be able to make it a win-win-win for the science, but also for the companies. Because one of the nice advantages is that when you bring researchers into the company, that's also one thing that we experienced during this IBM and Verdi first research project, is that everyone can meet on kind of a neutral ground where you start working on a joint objective to measure the outcomes. But this study can be co-created with the Works Council, with executives, with the management. So the first step, of course, for us, when we set up this new research project, is to engage in this co-creation process. And then, of course, it goes into a properly defining a randomization strategy, how to define a control group, which is also not always an easy task and not always very, very clear how it can be. So this too has to be defined properly, and it has to be defined together, because the key of a good field experiment is, of course, the good design. Once we have done this, we hope to go into the field experiment to measure again both the business case, what's the objective use of the implementation, but also the people case, to study how the changes induced by an AI affect employees.
Thank you, Marie-Christine. And Mark, as Marie-Christine had the first words, you're going to have the last ones. I know this is not how research is supposed to work, but if you could make a wish what the outcome would be, so to speak, what would you say a desirable future with an algorithmic society or workplace would look like? What would you say it would look like?
An ideal combination of watchful set of bodies. For example, the kind of regulatory body that we're talking about, a sort of FDA, with a kind of I like to say the larger program requires that we educate, that is, the general public, and certainly those making decisions, but the general public needs to understand automation and the part that AI plays there. And so educating is a very important part of that. And then we need the innovation to be brought to bear on any issues and potential harms that come up, and then we need regulation to put the guardrails in place. And I think that that triple educate, innovate, regulate is sort of my proposed framework for the way I think about it.
Thank you, Mark. There was actually quite an on-point wrap-up of what we are looking for with this conference and with the work, of course, of the AI Observatory and Denkfabrik. Thank you, both of you, for this, finale of 2 days of conference. I enjoyed it a lot. I wish both of you the best of luck, not only for your research, but personally as well, of course. And I think what we did in our session was we at least sufficiently outlined the importance of this kind of work and studies for a fair and safe AI society. Thank both of you.